My son thought he was doing me a favor. That's the part that still gets me even now. He actually believed he was being generous, giving me a roof over my head, letting me eat at his table, treating me like some charity case he'd taken in off the street. And when Thanksgiving came around last November, he decided that charity had run its course. I was 64 years old, standing at the front door of a house I had quietly paid for, holding a garbage bag with some clothes in it, while my daughter-in-law watched from the hallway with her arms crossed. Outside, the temperature in Edmonton had dropped to -18. There was black ice on the driveway. My son handed me my coat and said, "Dad, this just isn't working anymore." He thought he was cutting loose a burden. He had absolutely no idea what he was actually cutting. Let me back up a little. My name is Gerald. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer in Alberta. Roads, bridges, municipal infrastructure. Quiet work. Good pay, but nothing flashy. I drove the same Ford F-150 for 11 years. I wore the same Carhartt jacket every winter. When my wife Margaret passed from cancer in 2019, I sold our house in St. Albert and downsized to a small condo near White Avenue. People assumed I was struggling. I let them assume. What most people didn't know, what even my son didn't know, was that over the course of my career, I had made a series of quiet investments. Nothing dramatic, no stocks, no crypto. I bought land. Parcels of rural Alberta land starting back in the late 90s when prices were nothing. I also held a small ownership stake in a civil engineering firm I helped build before I retired. By the time Margaret died, the land alone had appreciated significantly. The firm's stake had paid out well. I was, by any reasonable definition, financially comfortable in a way that my flannel shirts and used truck did not advertise. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this because it matters for what happened next. My son is named Trevor. He's 38. He works in sales, software sales, the kind where you fly business class to conferences and talk about disruption and scalability. He married a woman named Courtney 6 years ago. Courtney grew up in West Edmonton in a house with a 3-car garage, and she has never, to my knowledge, owned a single thing that wasn't brand new. They have a daughter together, my granddaughter Sophie, who is 4 years old and is the best person I know. After Margaret died, Trevor called me one evening and said they had a spare room. He said it would be good for Sophie to have her grandfather around. He said he didn't like the idea of me rattling around alone in a condo. I believed him. I thought it was genuine. I rented out my condo on White Avenue, packed up my things, and moved into the spare bedroom of their house in Windermere. I want to be fair here. The first year was fine. Sophie and I would walk to the park in the mornings. I fixed things around the house. I cooked on the nights Courtney worked late. Trevor and I watched hockey together on Saturdays. It felt like family. Then something shifted. I'm not sure exactly when. Maybe it was around the time Trevor got a bigger commission and they started renovating the kitchen. Maybe it was when Courtney's mother started visiting more frequently and making comments about the arrangement. Whatever it was, the temperature in that house changed. I started noticing things. The way Courtney would go quiet when I entered a room, the way Trevor stopped inviting me to join them for dinners with their friends, the way they started having conversations that ended abruptly when I walked down the hallway. I should mention that I had been contributing to the household. I paid what Trevor called a contribution toward groceries and utilities, $1,500 a month in cash every first of the month. I also paid for Sophie's preschool fees, which were not cheap. I fixed the fence in the backyard. I replaced the water heater when it failed in February. I was not, by any objective measure, a burden. But that's not how Courtney saw it. I heard her one night through the wall. I wasn't trying to listen. I'd gotten up for a glass of water, and the house was quiet, and their voices carried. She was telling Trevor that her friends were asking questions, that it was embarrassing to explain why her father-in-law still lived with them, that she hadn't signed up to share her home indefinitely. Trevor said something I couldn't make out. She said louder, "Trevor, he doesn't even have a real income anymore. He's retired. What is he actually contributing?" I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went back to my room. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront them. I'm a quiet man. I've always been a quiet man. Margaret used to say it was my best quality, and my worst one at the same time. But I did make a phone call the next morning. I called my financial advisor, a woman named Patricia, who has managed my affairs for 15 years. I told her I might be making some changes soon. She said she was ready whenever I needed her. Thanksgiving weekend came. Trevor and Courtney were hosting, her parents, her sister's husband. I had offered to make the turkey. I make a good turkey. Margaret's recipe, brined overnight, roasted slow. I'd been planning it for 2 weeks. The Friday before Thanksgiving, Trevor knocked on my bedroom door in the evening. I was reading. He came in and sat down on the edge of the bed and didn't look at me right away, which is never a good sign with Trevor. He has his mother's tells. He said they needed to talk about the living situation. I put my book down. He said that he and Courtney had been thinking, and they felt it might be better for everyone if I found my own place. He said it wasn't about money. He said it wasn't about anything I'd done wrong. He said they just needed their space as a family. He used the phrase "our family unit" twice. Then he said they'd appreciate it if I could start looking for a place in the new year. I asked him quietly if this had anything to do with Courtney's feelings about the arrangement. He said it was a mutual decision. He said it very quickly. I told him I understood. I said I'd think about it. He looked relieved, stood up, patted my shoulder once, and left. I sat in that room for a long time that night. Here's what Trevor did not know. The house they were living in, the 4-bedroom house in Windermere with the double garage and the finished basement, the house where Sophie took her first steps, the house where Courtney hosted her book club every second Thursday. I had purchased that house, not as a gift, not as a loan, as an investment property, in my name, through my numbered company, 2 years before Trevor and Courtney moved in. They were renting it. The rent was paid to my numbered company. Trevor had signed a lease. He knew he was renting. He did not know who his landlord was. He'd never asked. I'd never told him. Patricia had handled all the paperwork. Trevor got a good rate. Because I wanted him to have a good rate, he thought he was renting from some faceless property management company. The lease renewal notices came from a management email address Patricia's office maintained. Trevor had lived in my house for 4 years and never once thought to wonder about who owned it. On the Saturday morning of Thanksgiving weekend, I got up early, made coffee, and called Patricia. I told her what had happened. I told her what I wanted to do. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about her. When I was done, she said, "Gerald, are you sure?" I said I was. She said she'd have the paperwork started by Monday. Then I told her about the other thing. Trevor had a business credit card, a Visa Infinite high limit, the kind that comes with airport lounge access, that was attached to a corporate account I had quietly guaranteed when he was starting out in sales and had no credit history. He'd built up his own credit since then, but the original guarantee was still technically in place. Over the years, he'd migrated his own spending to his own cards, but the account still existed, dormant, a detail he'd probably forgotten about entirely. I called the card issuer. I explained that I wanted to review the guarantee arrangement. I was very polite about it. They were very helpful. Then I called my son. He answered on the second ring. I could hear Courtney's family in the background already, even though it was only 10 in the morning. Someone was watching football. I told Trevor I'd been thinking about our conversation, and I wanted to let him know that I had found an arrangement that would work well for everyone. I told him I planned to be out by the end of November. He sounded genuinely relieved. He said, "Dad, I really appreciate your understanding." He said it like I'd just agreed to return a library book. I made the turkey anyway. I want to be clear about that. I made the turkey. I set it up in the roasting pan, and I left it in the fridge with instructions taped to the front. Then I packed my bags. Not a garbage bag this time. My actual luggage. I loaded my truck, said goodbye to Sophie, who was sitting on the floor playing with blocks and who held her arms up to me and said, "Grandpa, up." And I held her for a while. I told her I loved her. I told her she was the smartest person I knew. She told me she had a cracker in her pocket. Then I put her down, walked to my truck, and drove to the hotel I'd booked on Jasper Avenue. The room was on the 14th floor. I ordered room service. I watched the hockey game. Outside the window, Edmonton was gray and quiet under an early November sky. I slept better than I had in months. On the Monday after Thanksgiving, Patricia sent the first letter. It came from the property management company's legal address. Not from me, not with my name anywhere on it. It informed Trevor and Courtney that the property at their address had recently been reviewed as part of a portfolio reassessment and that the current lease would not be renewed at its December expiry. It gave them 60 days' notice. which was correct and legal under Alberta's Residential Tenancies Act. It also noted politely that the rent had been below market rate as a courtesy arrangement and that no extension could be offered. Trevor called me that evening. He was not calm. He said something had gone wrong, that he'd gotten a letter from his landlord about the house, that there must be a mistake. He said they'd been there 4 years, they'd never missed a payment. Why would anyone not renew? I listened. I told him that, unfortunately, rental markets were unpredictable and that he should probably start looking. He said that was easy for me to say, that he had a family, that uprooting Sophie in the winter was not a simple thing. I told him I understood. He said, "Dad, can you help? Can you talk to someone?" I said I would see what I could do. I did not see what I could do. Instead, I called Patricia and told her to let the process continue. 3 days later, Trevor called me again. His voice was different this time. Quieter. He said Courtney had been doing some research. She'd looked up the property records. She'd found the numbered company. She'd found, with a little more digging, that the numbered company was registered in my name. There was a long silence on the phone. He said, "Dad, you own our house." I said, "I own the house you've been renting." "Yes." Another silence. He said, "For how long?" I said, "Since before you moved in." I could hear him breathing. I could hear him breathing a background saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. Then Trevor said, very quietly, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I told him the truth. I said I hadn't told him because I wanted to help him without making him feel like he owed me something. I'd wanted him to have a good place to live at a fair price, without the complicated dynamic of knowing his father was his landlord. I'd thought it was the kind of quiet help that didn't need an announcement. I said, "I was trying to take care of you, Trevor, the same way I've always been trying to take care of you." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "And then you handed me a garbage bag and told me your home needed to be your family unit." He said that wasn't fair. I said I wasn't trying to be unfair. I was just being accurate. I want to stop here and say something, because I know how this story sounds. I know it sounds like a revenge story. It isn't, or at least it wasn't meant to be. I'm 64 years old. I don't have the energy or the interest in revenge. What I had was a decision to stop quietly absorbing the way I was being treated and to let the natural consequences of that treatment arrive without my interference. That is a different thing. Trevor asked if I would reconsider the lease. I told him that I would think about it, but that there was something I needed him to understand first. I needed him to understand that the $1,500 a month he'd called a contribution had been going into my own numbered company's account the whole time. In other words, I had essentially been paying a portion of my own rent to myself, and even that hadn't been enough to make Courtney feel the arrangement was fair. I needed him to understand that Sophie's preschool fees, the water heater, the fence, the 4 years of dinners and groceries, those hadn't come from a man with nothing. They'd come from a man who had plenty, who had chosen to be quiet about it, and who had been quietly dismissed anyway. Trevor said, "I didn't know, Dad." I said, "I know you didn't." There was something about saying that, "I know you didn't." There was something about saying that, "I know you didn't," that was harder than I expected, because underneath the whole thing, underneath the property records and the numbered companies and Patricia's letters, there was just a father who had moved in with his son after his wife died and had wanted, more than anything, to feel like he still had a place in the family. And for a while, he had. And then he hadn't. And that part had nothing to do with money. We talked for a long time that evening. More honestly than we had talked since Margaret died, maybe more honestly than we'd talked in years. Trevor cried, which I wasn't expecting. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood. He said Courtney had pushed, and he'd let himself be pushed, and he knew that wasn't good enough as an explanation, but it was the truth. I told him I believed him. I told him about Patricia's plan, the lease review, the timeline, what my actual financial situation was. I watched him recalibrate in real time, even through the phone. He kept saying, "I didn't know," and I kept saying, "I know." We went around that circle a few times. At the end of the call, he asked what he could do. I told him the first thing was to understand that what had happened could not simply be unhappen. I told him I needed time and I needed space, and I needed him to have a real conversation with Courtney. Not to convince her of anything, but to be honest with her about what values they were actually living by. I said Sophie was going to grow up watching how they treated people who seemed to have nothing to offer. I said that mattered more to me than any piece of property. He said he understood. I told him Sophie's trust fund, which I had set up 2 years ago through Patricia, quietly, the same way I did everything, was intact and untouched, and would be there for her education, regardless of what happened between him and me. I wanted him to know that. I didn't want anything that had happened to fall on her. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, I don't deserve that." I said, "She does." In the end, I renewed the lease, on different terms, a proper market rate, nothing hidden, everything transparent. Trevor knew who his landlord was. Courtney knew. If that made things awkward, that was information they could use. Patricia said it was the cleanest outcome from a legal standpoint. I thought it was the cleanest outcome from a human standpoint, too. I moved back into a condo, not the one on White Avenue, a different one, closer to the river with a better view. Sophie comes to see me every second weekend. We walk along the North Saskatchewan, and she tells me things that 4-year-olds consider important, which is everything, which is the correct attitude. Trevor and I talk on the phone now more than we did when I lived in his spare room. That's a strange thing about distance. Sometimes you have to step back before you can actually see someone. Courtney sent me a text message about 3 weeks after everything settled. It said, "Gerald, I owe you an apology. I'm sorry for how I made you feel in our home. I'm going to try to do better." It wasn't a long message. It wasn't flowery. I thought it was probably one of the harder things she'd had to write. I wrote back and said I appreciated it and that I hoped we could build something better going forward. I meant it. Margaret would have handled all of this with more grace than I did. She always had more grace, but she also would have wanted me to stop being quiet when quietness was no longer serving anyone. She used to say that keeping the peace and making peace were two entirely different things, and I'd spent too many years confusing the one for the other. I'm 64 years old. I still drive a truck that's 12 years old. I still wear the same Carhartt jacket in winter, and on Thursday evenings when Sophie is with me, I make her scrambled eggs, and she sits on the counter and hands me things and talks without stopping. And outside the window, Edmonton is cold and dark and perfectly familiar. And I think that whatever I did or didn't do right in my life, I got the important things right. That's enough. I keep coming back to that moment in the hallway, the one where I heard Courtney ask what I was actually contributing. I didn't say anything that night. I just went back to my room and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. And I think that moment, more than any letter Patricia sent or any phone call I made, is where the real story lives. Because here's what I've come to understand: the way people treat you when they think you have nothing left to offer. That's who they are, not the version they show at Christmas dinner or at Sophie's birthday party. The version that comes out when the lights are low and they think no one's listening. That's the truth of a person. And the truth of what happened between Trevor and me isn't really about a house or a numbered company or a Visa card with a reduced limit. It's about something simpler and harder than all of that. It's about whether you choose to see the person in front of you or whether you only see what they can do for you. I made my own mistakes in this. I want to own that. I spent years being quiet when I should have spoken. I convinced myself that helping without being seen was the noble thing, and maybe sometimes it is. But there's a version of staying quiet that isn't noble at all. It's just avoidance dressed up as humility. I was so careful not to make Trevor feel like he owed me anything that I never actually told him what I needed. I never said, "I moved in here because I was lonely after your mother died, and I wanted to still feel like part of a family." I never said that out loud to him once. That's on me, what I've learned. And I'm 64, so I'm a slow learner. But I get there eventually. Is that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about doing the right thing when you're tired, when you're hurt, when the easier path is to just go quiet and let things slide. Trevor had to learn that the hard way. I had to learn it a different way. Neither of us got there without cost. And there's something else. The decisions we make when we're under pressure, when we're embarrassed or scared or worried about what the neighbors think, those decisions have weight. Courtney's discomfort about the arrangement didn't come from nowhere. It came from a set of values she'd been building her whole life, And at some point, Trevor had to decide whose values he was actually living by. That reckoning came for him whether he was ready for it or not. It always does. Sophie doesn't know any of this yet. She's 4. She knows that Grandpa makes good scrambled eggs and that the river path near my condo has geese in the spring. That's the right amount for her to know right now. But one day she'll be older, and the world will ask her who she is when things get hard. And I really hope, that what she'll have by then is the kind of character that doesn't need an audience. The kind that holds steady not because someone is watching, but because she knows her own mind, and she's decided what kind of person she wants to be. That's the only thing I've ever really wanted to pass on.